Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you join us from around the world. Thank you ever so much for joining us on what is the first of a series of webinars, as it says, a series of thought-provoking webinars brought to you in a partnership with the Effico Academy and Social Value International. And today we have two fantastic speakers who I will introduce very shortly. And our topic, as you can see, maximising impact from rhetoric to reality. I hope you find this a really inspiring session. I hope it is thought-provoking, but also provide you with some solutions as well. Because as we go into the next slide, I think it's really important to recognize that the ideas around impact management and social value are becoming mainstream. I think it's fair to say that everybody, I'd like to go so far as to say everybody who is joining us on this call and people around the world joining this movement, it is going mainstream. I think we would all recognize the need to create more positive impacts. And a phrase I keep repeating quite often at the moment is, well, if not now, when? We all share this ambition to change the world, to increase our impacts, to improve our performance. And if we're not going to do it now, then when will we ever do it? But really importantly, really crucially, is how do we make these good intentions an absolute reality? And I think sometimes it can be a little bit scary, a little bit daunting, perhaps to think about some of the global challenges that we face and how we turn that into action in our own personal and professional lives. So I'd like to say hello. I'm the facilitator today. I have the easy job. I say hello at the beginning and the end and ask our fantastic speakers a few hopefully challenging questions. So I work with Social Value International. I'm the director of Impact. I'm very proud to be part of this organization. It is a movement that represents members in over 40 countries, and we have networks in over 25, and we are a global standard setter for social value and impact management. And we have an ambition, we have a mission to change the way society accounts for value. And the reason we have that mission is that we know by changing how we make decisions, making better decisions, we can improve levels of equality, we can increase people's well-being, and we can reduce the environmental harm and destruction that is created through our activities and our decision making. As a global standard setter, we are recognized as providing a pathway, a professional practitioner pathway. And I would hope that all individuals think about your own professional development. And we'll turn very shortly again to one of our speakers who is the founder of this movement as well. But this webinar is brought to you in partnership, and I'm very proud to talk about the partnership with the Effico Academy. I think it's always really important to begin by saying, well, what does Effico mean? And Effico is Esperanto for impact. It is a universal language, and impact management, I started by saying it's going mainstream. I would like to think that it is becoming universal. So the Effico Academy is a genuine attempt to break down some of the barriers that perhaps exist around spreading this movement around the world. And in partnership, we have created some fantastic online content, sharing experiences from myself, but really importantly, from a diverse group of speakers, a diverse group of experts and practitioners from around the world, sharing their insights on how social value and impact management is done in practice and creates real, tangible benefits. The course that we have developed, which is Social Impact Management, Applying the Principles of Social Value, is a truly interactive program. Please do have a look at the website. You will see that it includes over 100 activities. It includes those practitioner insights, case studies, and live interaction with your peers and the trainers as well. So a very, very exciting collaboration with the Effico Academy. We have lots of different opportunities for you to become a social impact professional, a social impact leader. I think that's probably enough from me for the moment. I can see some very helpful messages coming in from my colleagues, all of those technical things or the sort of housekeeping around maintaining your mute button on when you're not speaking. That would be fantastic. And the other prompt that I see, thank you so much, guys, is to say, please do contribute to this webinar. We want you to ask your questions. Use the chat feature. My colleagues will help me address some of those questions to our speakers, and we will turn to you as well and give you that opportunity. But before we go to an open question and answer session, we're going to have a conversation for about 35 minutes with our experts in the room today. And we have two fantastic people joining us. We have Amanda Feldman, who is the engagement lead at the SDG Impact. Now, this is an initiative created by the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, and they have a mission, a really important mission, to channel private investment and capital to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm going to ask Amanda lots of questions shortly about her optimism, her ambition, and how we actually realize those incredibly important sustainable development goals. And with Amanda's work, the focus is very much on creating products, standards, training, and certification to meet these incredible ambitions that I hope we all share. Now, Amanda is involved in many initiatives and is also one of the founders, co-founder of the Impact Management Project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Amanda, thank you ever so much for joining us. It's an absolute privilege to have you with us. And it is also a privilege to have Jeremy Nichols with us today as well. Jeremy, I know very well. He is the founder of Social Value International, the organization I've already mentioned. He is a non-executive director at the organization and one of the leading voices in the whole movement around social value and impact management. He is currently a visiting professor at Staffordshire University in the UK. He serves as an advisor to the Impact Management Project, an ambassador to the Capitals Coalition. He's also a non-exec director at a fantastic social enterprise that is very close to my heart in Liverpool, the Furniture Resource Centre. Find out more about these guys. They are great people. Have a look at their LinkedIn profiles and do connect with them. So without further ado, we will turn to the questions. This session is recorded and we will share the recordings and the slides with everybody who has attended today. So let's get into those questions. I'm desperate to ask Amanda and Jeremy some hopefully thought-provoking questions. So I first turn to Amanda. Are you ready for this, Amanda?
I'm ready. Hi, Adam.
Hey, nice to have you with us. Thank you again. It is great to see you. So, where are we? Where are we now when it comes to knowing what impact management means, but really importantly, how to effectively manage those impacts? An easy one to begin with, Amanda.
No pressure. Yeah.
No pressure.
Easy little while. Thanks, Adam. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining from all around the world. I guess I'll start just with some context. As with many of you, I think we are aware that there's been progress in some ways made over the past decade or longer, but I'll leave Jeremy to talk about that, around social and environmental impact, both understanding what's happening with our organizations and with our investments, and then to the theme of today's webinar, maximizing or optimizing the good and reducing negative impacts. There has been progress, Adam, is my first answer to your question. I feel that we are making progress. Part of that has been through public good efforts, like the Impact Management Project, like what UNDP is driving, like convergence efforts between standard setters, to just say we're better off if we agree on something, right? We will all have our different approaches. We should, right? There's no one answer to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. If there was, we probably wouldn't be in the current state of affairs we're in. So we need a diversity of approaches and perspectives and actions really to get us there. But it helps if we all know what we're talking about, if we can be transparent with each other on what good looks like, what bad looks like, and be very clear on what we're doing to maximize impact over time. And that's where I think we're seeing progress, Adam, on standards that are coming out with the UNDP, for example. They launched or are the steward, let's say, of the Sustainable Development Goals. But for people on the call, you know that they're often used almost like choose your favorite color. Right? It's like, this is the SDG I'm working on, ta-da. That's not really telling us what an enterprise is doing to contribute to that SDG, what other SDGs are interrelated with the one that you've chosen, and where potentially there are negative impacts on the SDGs that need to be managed as well. So I'm excited to be here today to talk with Jeremy and all of you about more around those trends, and then also what more we on this call can do to ask better questions and raise the game, because it's on us really to make sure that we continue to make progress and hopefully do our part in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And a nice segue for me to then turn to Jeremy. As you said, for the last decade or so, there's been progress in understanding and some convergence, growing convergence around standards and practice. And as you say, this movement's been going a bit longer than a decade. And I turn to Jeremy now and say, what still needs to change then, Jeremy? How far away are we from where we need to be based on our current approaches? If we're seeing progress, which is great, are we on the right path? Are we going to get there? How happy are you about this?
Hello, Adam, and hi, everybody. As Amanda said, thank you all for joining us. As you set this up to be thought-provoking, I'm hoping we're not provoking everyone to go off and make a cup of coffee at this point. It's horrible doing these virtual conversations where you're not with people, you can't see people, you can't really actually have that thing which makes us also human, our connections. So we bear with it. Do throw your questions in. But to answer your question, Adam, a long way. I think there has been progress, but if you kind of just look at the scale of the challenge we have, the rate at which inequality is increasing, the rate at which climate change is increasing. We all have heard a lot about build back better at the moment, but I think the reality is we're building back considerably worse. It's hard to realize that when we're all busy working hard. And I think the fundamental challenge underneath all this is the fact that, broadly speaking, the organizations that are working, whether they have a positive goal or not, are not really held to account for the consequences of their operations or for the impacts that they have, to use that word, by the people who experience them. There may be some accountability in there to the people who pay for them or fund them or whatever, but the people who experience it have very little power. And whilst we might recognize that, I think we massively fail to kind of see the implications that has had for practice. And so there's been a lot of convergence in this question of how to measure your impact and how to report on it. And I think that this has been completely the wrong way round from where we would start today if we could. And so, putting a report out on your impact generally in shock news shows that you have had an impact. How amazing. I pretty much guarantee it will be positive. I pretty much guarantee it will be overstated. And I pretty much guarantee it will not be as high as it could have been. The psychologists amongst us will recognize the risks of cognitive dissonance. What we get will reinforce our belief. There will be selection bias, and as organizations, we will avoid change. What we really need to be doing is reporting on our performance in increasing that level of impact. I mean, and just to take one example from the SDGs, and I'm going to pick my favorite color here is SDG 10, the wider one of inequality. But let's just go on 5 for a second with gender inequality. There's a lot of progress, people are moving, but the last figures I saw, which is a BBC report, said it's going to take us 100 years to achieve gender equality at current progress. And that was before COVID, when I think things have gone backwards. So I suspect it's now going to take us longer than that to achieve gender equality. And yet we're all busy doing our bit, And so there's such a risk of this every little bit helps, when, to be honest, I think if it allows us to believe that we're really getting to achieve these goals, then we need to think again. And it's as much about changing the culture within organizations as it is about changing these technical questions about measurement. But we can no doubt return to some of the solutions in a little bit, but that'll be my starter for 10, Adam.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think it's really important that we're all honest, you know, and I'm going to be honest and say we had a conversation before the webinar and we said, well, do we want to present an overly positive picture? I think it's absolutely crucial that Jeremy and Amanda and all of us are open and honest about the situation that we face. Now, I then can sense people, I become nervous myself, I become a bit overwhelmed and it feels incredibly daunting, and maybe we should just all, throw our hands up and go, it's too difficult. So this is a question to both of you, and Amanda, I'll ask it to you first, is what can people do who are watching this webinar? What can they do to avoid feeling so overwhelmed? And also in a way that it does create positive difference. I mean, making improvements to their own practice, but importantly, improving people's lives. And I think let's use Jeremy's words, how can we embrace the need to increase levels of accountability so that we do make positive change? What can people do?
Yeah, it's a great question, Adam, because part of my biggest fear, to Jeremy's point about building back better, is that we make it so complicated to build back better that everyone just says, forget it, I'm back. I've built something that ought to be good enough. No one seems to be yelling and screaming. So let's just hide over here behind this rock. I really think the one thing we can all do is not take that approach. Do something, and don't be scared that it's not perfect, because I mean, I'd love Jeremy's thoughts on this, but we're all winging it. Like, at the end of the day, we can have as many standards and frameworks and metrics, and we can look at them, and they require judgment, right? They require better decisions. They require a third party to say, whatever you just decided based on that data is not right. You should rethink that. It requires us all coming together as peers, as colleagues, as investors and entrepreneurs, right? And having more of a constructive conversation of, this is what I think is happening. This is what I've heard from my stakeholders. And this is how I think I can make it better, or at least less bad. And for me, it's that starting point, Adam, of just saying, we all have it in us to ask better questions. It doesn't matter to me anymore whether it's the perfectly phrased question. It matters to me if we're not asking them at all. And same with data. Like, if we don't have perfect data, it doesn't mean we don't publish a report or we don't share it with our stakeholders or our communities. We share what we have and say what we don't have. And guess what? As with anything, someone might put their hand up and say, actually, I know a way that you can get better information on what's happening to these people in my community, or this part of the environmental challenge we're facing, and let's do it together. So it's a very, almost too simplistic, and I don't want to, and it's not to lower the bar, right? It's not to lower the bar. It's to say that if we're all not doing our part in whatever organizational context we're working in, then we're missing the biggest opportunity of our time, which is that we have enough, I think, and Jeremy, I hear your point. We're not there yet, but we have enough to get started. And the first thing that we can all do is ask the questions. The second is be more transparent about what we're learning. And the third is actually do something about it, even no matter how small. And that's, yeah, I'll pause there. Very simplistic, but also I hope reducing sort of these barriers to entry that I know I talk to a lot of people and entrepreneurs who feel that they're just not smart enough yet. And I really don't want anyone on this call to think that that's the right answer.
Thank you. Yeah, Jeremy, same to you. What can people do? We know one another well, and we know everything Amanda's just said, that people go, well, I can't do something until it's almost perfect. And that's not what Amanda's just been saying. So over to you, Jeremy. What are your reflections?
No, I completely agree. I think because of this accountability thing, which I think is so fundamental, we've taken an approach to measuring, which has kind of set this bar really high, almost a kind of social science level of purity that everyone's expected to achieve. In a world where businesses are making decisions with whatever data they can get all the time. It's like we're saying, but if you want to talk about impact, then you have to have this super high bar. Of course, doing something within that still needs to think about what it would mean to be accountable, and it needs to think about the rate at which we're making decisions. But we do need to shift to doing and decision making away from measuring and reporting. And you can do that tomorrow morning. I just want to, if I take a bit of time to reflect on this in FRC's experience just quickly, because FRC, as you mentioned, is a social enterprise in Liverpool. It turns over about £10 million a year at the moment and is fully trading, providing household furnished services and bulky waste services under contract. And we've always reported, I'm going to wear that hat for a second, we've always reported on our impact in one way or another, and also always had that audited, obviously. But we have reflected over the last couple of years at the extent to which we've been using that information internally for decision making. And there has been a massive shift in the way we think about this, to the point where we could talk about the kind of decisions we've made, but to the point we also measure the number of decisions that we're making around impact. Management teams have to support those and provide that information, and it filters its way up to the board. And that is a big shift in showing that we're not hung up about the amazingness of the data. We have the data we have, we're aware of the risks within it, but we are absolutely focused on using it to increase impact. I just think you need to put this in against the backdrop. We live in an economic system which is driving resources to be allocated in order to generate financial returns without having to be responsible for the consequences of those returns. And that is having impacts on the world at probably a much, almost certainly at a higher rate than anything we're doing in the impact conversation is offsetting it, let alone turning it around. So whilst you can do something really quickly just by getting some data and getting on with it, I think at the same time, we need to recognize that system change requires a shift in legislation. It requires a more communal and shared approach to these, where we get up and we say, actually, what are we lobbying for as a group? We can't do this as individuals. And again, in FRC, there's been that realization that whilst we had a social impact, and that was great, the challenge or the problem that we were trying to address was not going away at all at scale. And we have also then increasingly shifted towards campaigning for system change alongside our enterprise activities. So I think as organizations, we can do both those things. And as individuals, we just have to have something sitting on our shoulder when we say this is too hard. And remember, that's an excuse that if we were actually held to account by the people whose lives we are changing, we would not be able to make.
Great, thank you. There's questions starting to fly in as well, which we'll share very shortly. So I do think that the conversation is not terrifying people. I think it's really offering people some solutions as well. And we've maybe touched on this a little bit. We know about the scale of the problem. And I really like, Amanda, your phrase, which I think I might use in a moment when I come back to you, is we're all winging it. I really like that idea.
It's been recorded, that, hasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It's gone down in, we're keeping that one for a while, Amanda. Thank you.
Good.
Are you optimistic about the future, or maybe not the future? Are you optimistic about the chances that we can do what is required, that we can, it's such a hashtag at the moment, isn't it? Build back better. And it's like, we've talked about from rhetoric to reality. So how are you optimistic we can take fantastic rhetoric and turn it into reality? Can we achieve the SDGs? Are you optimistic?
Who's going first on that?
You, because you go first.
There you
okay,
go,
well, I am optimistic, and we wouldn't do this if we weren't. One of the kind of challenges of this is, it feels grim, but you get up and you've got to keep going on it. But I think there's some reasons to be optimistic. We've been arguing around this decision-making piece should be driving the whole structure for a long time, but I think things are changing. And if people haven't looked at the UNDP's impact standards, go and look at them. I think they are really awesome in setting a bar, which is really about this issue about decision-making, making changes, and being informed by people who do not have a voice. The fact that the UN is in this game, means that we're looking at this from the perspective of people's human rights. And that is a very powerful backdrop for getting going on these things. There are others as well. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development has always been very focused on decision-making. Capital's Coalition You can probably share some links for these to other ways, Adam, but there are lots of reasons to be optimistic. There's a lot more happening around the shifting in company reporting at the moment. There's bigger civil society recognition of some of these issues, which often are seen as very boring when you're dealing with the challenges on the ground of people's lives. And someone comes and says, let's do some changes in fiduciary duty as a legal issue, and everyone falls asleep. But I think that is, people are realizing that that is something that we need to change fundamentally, and they're the kind of things that are happening. So yeah, we're getting, if we, optimism means getting to a tipping point, and then we'll get over that tipping point, and I think we can remain optimistic. We can achieve the SDGs.
Fantastic. Amanda, are you as optimistic as Jeremy?
I am optimistic, as Jeremy says we have to be, and a big principle of how I work is that, that I think we're all motivated or want to, or, we'll grow faster, better, stronger when motivated by a bit of optimism and positivity and sunlight. I do think that we really all need to hear, and I've seen in the chat already questions of like, where are the good examples? Where are the good stories? Like, give me something to show that this is possible and that we can together, have better impacts and maximize our impact, positive impact on the world. If you ask me SDGs by 2030, I mean, we would be remiss to discuss the Millennium Development Goals, which had an earlier deadline and that we updated, and now it's 2030, and I think it's great. And obviously, I'm here with as an engagement lead for the UNDP's SDG Impact Initiative, but I do think it's all about the process of getting there, right? Which I'm most optimistic about. The SDGs are incredibly interrelated. They will require huge systemic shifts in government and policy and private sector, and how businesses work and how civil society operates. It's a huge task ahead. And I think it's complex. So I would just say what I am optimistic about is, versus saying, yes, by 2030, like done and dusted, 17 goals, including just partnerships for all, are going to be sorted. I think what I'm more excited about and optimistic about is that by 2030, we won't have to have the conversation anymore that like impact can be positive and negative, right? Or that everything we do has positive and negative impacts on people and the planet, and we have to manage them. Like, these are the things that where I am now and where I see us going is really changing the norms and the expectations around how we manage our organizations and our performance and what good looks like. And I am very optimistic about both the SDG impact standards helping improve practice around that in terms of impact management project and training like Efiko Academy and others who are saying we can all look for better data. Right. And we should, and we actually have more than we think, and let's talk about it and do better with it. So I think that's where I'm very optimistic, to change the question a bit, Adam and Jeremy. And I don't see, I can't see that slowing down, especially if everybody on this call and with the entire networks that we can all bring to bear, stay focused on raising the game.
It's a good point. I think if you can go back a couple of years and people were still very much focused on only positive impact, and there was a kind of, I don't know, a blind spot or denial or something that said negatives, what, so that is changing. And there's still pockets of people who think they should only be responsible for measuring the positive impacts and ignoring the negatives. And just on that then, just quickly then on the question about some good examples. In the corporate space, I would recommend people look at Kering, which is the French holding company for companies like Puma and Gucci. And they produce an annual report on their environmental impact, which is valued at, I think it's about 500 million euros this year. And it's all negative. They only report on the negative, and they're managing that against targets. And I think that's an amazing level of transparency and openness for a corporate to be putting out that it's having this negative valued effect on the world and managing that. At the social enterprise level, FRC, obviously, FRC Group, we need to get that website public, the reports are there, it's all on the website. And then an investment and an investor, because of where we are, who we're talking to, Sherpa, I would say the Belgian-based investor, and particularly their SI2 fund, which is embedded, I think, impact management in the requirements of investees, and also in the way that the board are assessed and their performance is assessed against social returns as well as financial returns. I'm sure Timothy will correct me if that's wrong, but I just think there are a few quick, really good examples. There are not enough, and it's hard for businesses to share examples of their internal decision making, which is what we want, but it is getting a lot better. Both the Capitals Coalition and SBI websites have loads of examples of organizations on them doing this. So.
Can I also jump in really quickly, Adam, because there was a great follow-on question to what I said from John Sherman about whether we think that people will change their behavior without public policies, like changing quickly. And I said that I don't see momentum stopping on this, and I'm just going to stand by it, even if public policies take more time to be developed and to be implemented. I think they're critical. I do think there is private sector push, no matter what, whether they see it from a perspective of value creation, opportunity, and goodwill, or risk mitigation, worrying, as we all do, about the systemic risks of what we're doing in terms of inequality, climate, and other issues. And I really think I believe that investors and investees are changing their behavior for a wide range of reasons. It could be fear of regulation someday. That's fine. But I also think it's about managing risks to them over the next 10 years. And I also think it's all being at the front end of opportunities as they see them. So John, I just wanted to flag this really great point of sort of the order of things. And I think we're getting to a point of making the case that this matters no matter how quickly or slowly public policy comes into play, but that private sector has a role to play, both to just minimize risk and maximize opportunity.
I'm gonna, George, you're all right there, aren't you, Adam? Because there's a bit, I think it's such an important question, this, about the balance between legislation and voluntary action. And I do think that voluntary actions will take us so far. They'll show what's possible, but they will not get the level of general performance. I do also not think that it is right that when we're talking about impacts on people's lives, that it should be either investors or enterprises who decide how they should do that. They're largely, trade bodies acting in the interests of their members on these issues. And it's very hard to actually then consider what you're doing if you're doing it from the perspective of the people who are experiencing the impact, which is why it's so great that the UN is involved in this, because they are very clearly taking that perspective. And it's the kind of initiative which has the legitimacy to inform public policy. Legislation comes when people feel comfortable that it will happen, that it's enforceable. But just imagine, we have a world where everyone is expected to report on their financial performance every year without exception and have it audited by someone acting in the interests of the investors. We do not have a world where everyone is expected to report every year without exception on the consequences of their operations on the lives of people around the world in their supply chains, and where that information is audited by someone acting in the interests of the people whose lives have been affected. And again, with the UN standards, looking at an assurance framework, which will be voluntary to start with, but will show that it is possible for someone to do that, not reporting to the management, but reporting in effect to the people who experience impact. I think that's changing, and I think these things are also happening around some of the regulatory regimes in the International Accounting and Auditing Standards Board. This is pretty dry stuff, you might think, but this is the nuts and bolts which sit underneath the economic systems we live in. And everyone ignores them. We don't see them in our day-to-day lives, but they're the things that we really are going to have to change. And voluntary action shows it's possible, but I really do believe we need to change some of these nuts and bolts.
Thank you, guys. You've made my job particularly easy so far, and I hope you continue to do so. I hope I'm not dragging us back a bit, but that winging it phrase is still in my mind, and maybe not so much winging it, Amanda, but this point about, again, what I hear is lots of amazing things, and then I heard that key word for me, which is judgments, and not having perfection and perfect data. But I still hear too often that, we can't do something because, and Jeremy, you talk about excuses. We can't do something because the data's not good enough or whatever it may be. So I think, let's talk about this. What do we mean by making judgments? And And then how they sound risky. Is this, you said it's not a perfect social science, Jeremy. I think we should expand on that point a little bit, please. Amanda, not winging it, but what are we talking about with judgments?
I mean, let's stick to the winging it point. I think if we can acknowledge that that we need information and want to do good for people on the planet, do more good and less bad. Something that Jeremy and I have had the joy of working on together, actually, over the past few years, has been on impact risk, right? You might want a huge financial return, but there is a risk that you won't get it with your investments. In that same light, right? We may want and have judgment within our organizations that good is happening for people on the planet, but that may not be happening the way we expect. And in that sense, it's about not necessarily saying excuses, we can't, we won't, right? But rather coming in upfront, set expectation management is king, right? Just saying, these are the impact risks that we see to be very high in our organization, in the work we do within this partnership, right? And then once that's on the table, what's an example of impact risk? Evidence risk, the risk that we don't have data, that things are going well or going poorly. Stakeholder participation risk, the risk that people are, we think, doing generally better, but they don't realize or experience that themselves, right? It's maybe sort of unseen or unknown. I'll leave Jeremy to go through all the rest of the impact risks. And the reason I'm flagging it, all you, is because if we start to be more open and transparent about the impact risk we're facing as much as the impact expectations we have, and alongside, we can mitigate those risks, right? We can make our judgments about what's good and bad, and then also have in the back of our mind, are we making sure these risks are being managed in case this doesn't happen as we expect? For me, this is a really key part of how we move forward on impact is holding both in our minds and recognizing that sadly, unlike financial risk, it doesn't hit our pockets often, right? But it is people's lives and the planet that lose out. And so we have to be extra conscious of it because it's not going to hit us necessarily where it hurts. It's going to affect others. And so it's on it. And I think this is a really important part of the growth and practice that we're seeing. Jeremy, over to you to add anything else, but this is how I manage, Adam, this point of judgment, and then what we can do to make sure that we're on track and being transparent about what could go differently.
I agree. I think, again, this moving away from this measuring perfection to I'm going to use this data to choose different ways of doing things or make decisions is going to add a couple of risks. If I want to choose between option A and option B, the risk is that I should have been doing option C. I've missed that one out completely. And then the risk is that I choose option A when I should have done option B because my data wasn't good enough. And that's what we should be thinking about, really. And when we say the risk, we are talking not about the financial risk to our organizations. We're talking about the risk to the people who are experiencing impact. Now, of course, we haven't thought about that. We haven't been thinking about decision-making. We haven't been thinking about risk like that, all because there's no consequences if we get this wrong. You know, if you make a mess of your finances, questions will be asked. The managers responsible, their jobs are at risk on those. But if the impact isn't as much as it was expected, and that's assuming that the organization has indeed set a target for what could be expected, which is still not common, but let's say they have, and you don't achieve your impact, then you know there are really rarely any consequences for that, and the consequences are felt by other people who maybe experience negative impacts, but I think just aren't experiencing the level of positive impact that was possible. Organizations, you know, if you just change your thinking from a question of did we have an impact to are we having as much impact as we can? And when we started asking that question in FRC, we had to look around and go, do you know, we don't really know. No, we don't. I mean, we know we're having one and we've got reports on that. But if you ask us, is it as high as it could be? That's a difficult question. And so then you start thinking about making decisions, then you start thinking about the risks. But the challenge there is how do you assess effectively what's the risk appetite within this? Because you're making that choice when your judgment says, okay, I've assessed the risk and it's okay. I'm still going to do this. And I think the area that we still haven't really looked at is that when you think about that, you should be thinking about it from the perspective of the people who are actually taking the risk. You know, that's the people experiencing impact, is what is their risk appetite for the decisions you're about to make. And this is an area where I think we have yet to I've not seen anybody exploring that. I would, of course, be glad to say, I am glad to say that FRC have now got that on the table to start doing some assessments of the staff, board and stakeholder risk appetites. And if anybody else has got any examples of people both assessing impact risk, not financial risk, and assessing the risk appetite of the various people involved, please share it, because it's something we know we need to start working on as soon as, really.
So the next part of us winging it is thinking about how to understand. And I think it's really important to remind ourselves, we use this language about impact and maximising and so on. We are talking about people's lives and how decisions affect those people. So I hope people recognise that this this element of the conversation, we've got a lot of questions coming in from people, and Jeremy and Amanda are fantastically looking at the chat and addressing those questions. But I know it's fantastic, isn't it? It really is. It's making my job so easy. But I might turn to a couple of people now, and perhaps Sophie Robin, you ask a question about how this accountability principle can be applied in a specific context. Sophie, I wonder if you want to articulate that question better than I am doing at the moment yourself.
This is way too hard a question. We have to pass over Sophie B2B.
That's why we chose that. Joe Leek, we're coming to you next. There's some warning. Sophie, to you.
Hi, thanks, Adam. Well, I didn't expect to be there in the front line. Everyone else had their question in the slide without having to be in the front line. No, well, basically, it's like we talk a lot about this direct impact of organizations, especially businesses, on people and the planet, assuming that most organizations have a direct impact on, those people. And Jeremy always say, or you would talk about those people that we impact, to which we impact their lives through our activities. And I'm thinking about, well, we're a consultancies, but we're not the only ones. There's many organizations and businesses acting in the service area, right? And we are in the B2B, meaning to say we provide services to other companies. And yet we think we can produce positive and negative impacts, right? So the question is, in that reflection around those SDGs and making an impact and making a change and being accountable for those changes, how do you consider that in all these B2B service-oriented organizations? And is there any positive examples that you've seen around that? Certainly, I find it very difficult to link our activities to the SDGs, for example, as much as I would like to. But those questions are very much in our minds, since we also work around our own impact report.
It's a really good question, and it's a good example of where being pragmatic about what information you can get is going to be critical. So FRC have faced this challenge because one of the things, obviously, we're a supplier of furnished housing solutions to care homes, to housing associations, who are then providing housing to people, and that is where the kind of impact of the product is happening, and we are just a supplier into that, and we do not claim any of the impact relating to that because of that. How would we possibly attribute any of it to ourselves? What's our little bit of that? What's the share of that? And to what extent would that information make us feel happy about making lots of different types of decisions? And I think there are going to be situations where the data you have simply is not going to be good enough, in the sense that it doesn't meet your risk appetite for making some types of decisions. And then we have to think about getting better. So there's not an immediate fix for all of these. Short of doing a nice sample of all your clients and talking to all of them in a nice, properly randomized controlled trial of non-clients, and seeing whether the people who are not your clients have got impact reports where their impact is going up faster than the group. Well, you can see what madness that will be. It's never going to happen with that kind of level of purity. So you do have direct impacts on people's lives, which you can look at. But you're right. I think the interesting question is, how do we start to think about the impact that we have now? As Social Value International have had this challenge as well. They are, an intermediary with members who are intermediaries to people. It's a long, long way away. And so there has to be some use of proxy data within this. So, Social Value International used take up of its principles as a proxy and said, if people are increasingly using our principles and understand them, we can make an assumption that they are making better decisions. That's a big leap of faith, perhaps, but it's kind of what else do you do while you're trying to improve things? So I think you do whatever, you get started on this, as Amanda said, you wing it. I couldn't possibly say wing it, but I would say, sometimes
Jeremy agrees, Adam. We've got consensus.
I agree, but bad data can be good enough for some decisions. I think we've really got to, what people sometimes say is bad data, we can go, well, hang on, it's okay for this decision. So you may still find, so get going on that. But the question I think is always, whatever you get going on, how do you use that to change the way you interact in a B2B relationship? If it doesn't change the way you're acting with your customers, the way you deliver services, the way you interact with them, then why are you collecting the data? I mean, our focus is increasingly being on the extent and rate at which you make those decisions. And the assumption is, if you're making more decisions influenced by some impact data, you are going to be having more impact than not. And that is an assumption, but it's better than nothing at the moment. And I would crack on with that and come back and say to us, whatever you did, Sophie, we've changed this in our business model, and we've changed this in the way we deliver this product. Then we go, that's fantastic. That's empowering, and you can get on with it.
Well, that's what we do at the moment. Thanks.
Robin Brady seems to have excellent advice in the chat. But just to add one more practical thing that I tend to use, because, well, first of all, it really, for anyone who's working on this topic, one of the things that I'm excited that we're slowly moving away from is splitting pennies. I say, or splitting pence, right? Like, no, this bit of the penny was me. Like, I did that impact and you did that impact. And at the end of the day, do people on the planet who are being affected care whether it was your penny or her penny? No, they don't. So first of all, as long as it's coming from the perspective of what are we doing, we want to know, and not, no, I swear that my dollar created that outcome for that person. It's a healthy, I think this is a healthy conversation. The second thing I use is often the investor contribution consensus of the impact management project. We're not talking about an investor contribution right now, but we are talking about you as an organization having a portfolio of projects and clients that you work with. And what are you doing in that process? Are you signaling that impact matters in those projects? Are you engaging actively and sharing your resources, your network, your expertise to improve impact in those projects? Are you growing? Are you making sure that they're reaching the most underserved wherever they can? So I would suggest that people go to that consensus, because I find it quite helpful. Thinking B2B, or if anyone on the call is an investor, thinking about your contribution, which isn't claiming the impact of the client or the enterprise in your portfolio, but rather saying, what have you done to encourage more impact and better impact over time?
I think that's really so important. Social Value's work on this has always said, identify who else is contributing to the change that's important to the person experiencing it. And then do not fight about how much is your share, but go and work with them. If you're not working with people, other organizations, you're almost certainly not operating at a system level, and therefore not creating, that kind of systemic changes that's required. And although organizations mature to that, I think another good proxy, apart from the number of decisions you make, is how much of your time is spent working in meaningful partnerships, let's call them, with the other organizations that create value for the people that you are serving, or that you influence or impact.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you. The questions are coming in thick and fast, and we've got some time to deal with more of them. I'm going to turn to Joe Lee. Joe, you ask a question about, so we've heard this, that Amanda sees this optimistic future where we go, of course we measure, of course we manage, of course there are positive, and of course there are negative outcomes. Joe, over to you. You wanted to ask something about the acceptance of the negatives, if you like.
Yeah, I think it's really, sorry, hi everyone, I hold my hands up as well. I work for a public authority in the UK, so I work for Liverpool City Region Combined Authority. So we do have investment powers, and we have certain devolved powers, but being involved in that public funding landscape, I just wondered how much work's being done up top in terms of not just public policy, but actually public funding, because the funding often dictates what the policy will say and vice versa. And we can't ignore that. So we have Green Book in the UK, and that's largely does focus on positive outcomes. You know, it's all about what is this big impact of this big massive infrastructure project, but let's ignore the fact that it's gone through lots of greenfield land, and we don't really kind of do a holistic picture. We just focus on the positive. And I just wondered if there's any work being done with governments or anywhere that's got it particularly right in that space.
I can answer from one angle, and Jeremy, I'm going to throw it over to you, maybe for projects like enterprise level in the UK, if we're seeing any negative impact work being done. I'm not sure. Joe, there is interesting work in the US that I hope will, and going more global around the invest. It might not totally directly affect your work, but I think for other people on the call it could be interesting. I mentioned a positive investor contribution, and the impact management project consensus was like, what can you do as an investor to signal that impact matters, right? Or engage more actively. They're all very positive. What about the negative side of the way we structure our investments, right? What about negative investor contributions? For example, we're seeing in private equity, right? Compensation over leverage, like what happens to people who are working in portfolio companies when it goes bankrupt. You know, some of our existing structures do have negative impacts as well as positive. And so while it's not directly answering your question, I encourage people to look at the Predistribution Initiative for new research coming out on what's happening at investment structure level that we might want to ask better questions about. And then I think, Jeremy, over to you in terms of at the company level, whether we're seeing a push on, you know, raising the bar about negative as well as positive.
It's interesting. I mean, this is UK, so the Green Book that Joe mentions is the government's requirement to look at cost-benefit analysis in your public investment, and ideally all through your expenditure decisions at an appropriate and proportionate level, and should, in theory, having been on the training for that, also cover negatives. But it is an example of what happens in practice and the bias that we all have as human beings. Human beings find it very hard to recognize negative consequences of our activities, which is why we have the law to make us accountable for those things when they happen. And so, you know, the national, governments generally have some kind of audit function, but it comes in quite late in the day. So I agree that although I think the Social Value Act, certainly the second round of it has certainly moved on from the first. I think the guidance is really interesting and really good. But it would be nice if it was to say something like, and tell us about the negative impacts that we know you're having. Don't try and hide from it. And I do think that until we get to this similar requirement as we do in finance, where it's the audit that tests that, if you didn't have an audit function, businesses would, I suspect, report slightly higher profits to their shareholders and slightly lower profits to the taxpayer than is currently the case. So we need that external check to make sure our very human bias doesn't get in the way. And we need, therefore, to have some kind of level of assurance of organizations' impact reporting and impact information. The other thing that, although it's happening on a positive note, I think, is that the SDGs are gaining traction as well in the public sector. And I think the conversations now happening around the Social Value Act and the SDGs allows us a frame to say you can't cherry pick 2 SDGs you like. You have to look at the whole set, and you have to tell us about the positive and negatives. And if we can bring the UN standards consequently into the conversations around the Social Value Act at a high level, I think we can start to push that recognized negatives down, recognizing that in a tendering situation, when you're the company trying to win work, it's very hard for you to do. And here we have some negatives. And again, I'm just going to share another FRC example of a time when one of our competitors in a tendering process held up our social value report and said, look at them, they have negative outcomes, we won't do that, without any evidence to that whatsoever. And so the very transparency that we brought to that worked against us. And so we have to we have to reward that, which is why I like caring, rather than using it as a tactic to beat people up on.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you so much, everybody who has made my job, as I say, incredibly easy today, made their job hopefully challenging, and stimulated everybody along the way. The questions have been amazing. It shows that, yes, we do have, a collective passion and interest around these ideas. And I've I've scribbled some sort of notes to summarize this for myself as we perhaps go back to the presentation as well. And, you know, there's an optimism. This is the biggest opportunity. We've got the chance to do things now. It's time to build back better, not just build something perhaps, but then we don't need that level of purity. It doesn't need to be a super high bar. We're winging it to a degree. But there's that big burning question about what it means to be accountable. And let's not worry too much about splitting that penny. I really like that. There's a lot of phrases I'm stealing from Amanda today. And we're hopefully at the tipping point where legislation and practice is moving together. But let's remind ourselves that when we talk about impact management, yes, it's talking about improving things, making those decisions, but it's really talking about reducing the risk that we make the wrong decision, that we make those suboptimal decisions. And the people who experience the risk are those affected by the decisions, not those making them themselves. So it's time to use some data. It's time to take some action. And I think it's really important that we again go, well, look, this is a reality. And of course, this is the first of a series of these amazing, this has been a high bar, by the way, guys. Our next session has two fantastic speakers. We have Bonnie Chu and Joanne Anderson, joining us next time on the 23rd of March, where we take a lot of the ideas that have been discussed about listening to people's voices, particularly listening to marginalized voices, and how that can help drive improvements, increase impacts, and reduce those risks that people are negatively affected by our decisions. It's really important that we see the opportunities for our own development here, and the Effico Academy, in partnership, in collaboration with Social Value International, can really help you on your journey. We have this series of webinars, but I would strongly encourage you to have a look at the Effico Academy website. Remember, Effico is Esperanto for impact. It means we are all on a journey and we can all develop our own practice. There are some great opportunities to connect with your peers, to connect with some fantastic experts and practitioners from around the world, engaging in a real community and cohorts of learners so that you develop your skills and become that social impact professional. Develop your existing skills, put them into practice, increase impacts, fulfill your own ambitions, and improve people's lives.
One other thing, Adam.
Please, Jeremy.
Buy this book.
Now, I can't make that plug because I'm co-editor, but it's a very good book. Find out more on the Effico website as well. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. I really, really hope to see you again. I've really enjoyed myself. I hope you found this thought-provoking, stimulating, but also providing you with some solutions. Training, of course, is one of those. Thank you ever so much. Enjoy the rest of your morning. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your evening, wherever you are around the world. Thank you so much, everyone.